Let's kick off with our climate action program, nature and biodiversity session, and let's see what we're going to have a look at. Our team, as I was saying, is myself, Megan Best, and I am the co-founder and manager of Native Events, founded in 2017 as a response to the accelerating crisis that was unfolding around us and trying to bring something to the creative industries and the events and festivals that we were working with. Katrina, I might let you introduce yourself very quickly there.
Sure, Katrina Fallon with the Green Arts Initiative, which was set up in association with Theatre Forum as well as Performing Arts Forum as is, and trying to do my best, I suppose, to support arts organisations to reduce their impacts, both in terms of climate and the environment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katrina. And as I was mentioning, Brecken is our programs manager, and she's in the background, and she will be monitoring and managing the Q&A and the chat and posting some links in there. So keep an eye there too. So as you're probably very aware at this point, because we've been chatting about this a lot, but we are running a series of training webinars with the Arts Council this year, all towards climate action. Basically, we kicked off with a bit of policy development. We've worked on developing action plans. Last week, there was one on understanding and measuring impacts and beyond just the carbon impacts. And today we're looking at nature and biodiversity. Next week, then, will be energy and then running into materials and procurement. And there will be more sessions then towards in the autumn. There'll be September to October. We'll be doing some webinars for festivals specifically because they're in their production cycle now, and also some more training and mentorship opportunities. If you didn't manage to get to the previous sessions, we've run 4 now at this stage. You can access the recordings and the slides, as I said, at that hub on the Climate Action Arts Council Climate Action Hub on their website. So what are we going to cover today in this session? So we're going to look at the nature crisis. I like to use the term nature as opposed to biodiversity. I think it's a bit more realistic. Biodiversity is a little bit sterile and harder to get your head around. But we're going to be looking at what's happening in terms of nature, both globally and at home in Ireland here. We're going to explore a term called the shifting baseline syndrome. And I know that sounds like a bit of a mouthful for now, but it's just to really look at the degradation of nature and how we are perceiving it in our day-to-day lives and what we can do specifically in the creative sector to rise to that. I'm going to have a quick look at some of the progress to date. And again, this is more both internationally and locally, and what we can do specifically with our own arts organisations, some practical tips and tricks there. We're going to look at some examples and case studies that are relevant for the arts sector in Ireland, some of the tools and resources that are available, and then at the end, there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A. So today we're hoping to cover lots of different aims in this session and to really kind of get to grips with understanding where we are at and what we can do in terms of the nature and biodiversity crisis. So Katrina, over to you for a few.
Hopefully that will, we'll tic-tac a little bit between us because it's important than anything else to make sure that everybody's sort of wide awake. So what are the aims of the session this morning? So I suppose one of the key aims is to give you an understanding, which I'm sure many of you already have, of the fairly fragile state of the natural world and the pressures that have been brought to bear on that natural world. And sadly, a lot of that is coming from us. Second is to look at what is being done nationally and internationally to protect nature and to protect the natural world, to give you some guidance on what arts organisations can do to protect nature. So we'll be covering that in a bit more detail later on in the session, to give you examples of those doing good work. And we're going to use one particular very rich example because it covers a very broad range of actions and initiatives, and that's Visual in Carlow. And hopefully maybe to give you a little bit of hope, because it can be quite a dark topic for many people. I suppose just recognising and seeing how nature is struggling due to human impacts. And I suppose this is an image that I've often used when we go, we're taking you all with us. And I suppose that's just highlighting how dependent we really are. This is bees, but obviously on insects particularly, and it's something that we maybe don't always acknowledge. And for many arts organisations, they may justifiably think that biodiversity is not an issue for them, as they don't have perhaps a dedicated area that's dedicated to biodiversity. But really, it's the responsibility of all of us, because everything that humans do, everything that we do has an impact on nature. And unfortunately, most of it is negative. And a lot of the time, I think, and this is something that Megan's going to talk about in more detail, we don't really notice nature. And that's probably particularly true if you're living or working in an urban setting. And therefore, because we haven't noticed it, we don't notice that it's disappearing. And that's that whole baseline syndrome that Megan is going to talk about. And the many forces that are causing a dramatic decline in nature come from how we live, where we build, how we eat and farm, how we travel, the goods we consume, the waste we generate, the chemicals we use in so many ways, and climate change. So if arts organizations think, understandably, that biodiversity loss is not their concern, well, that would typify how many people feel. But, it's not true. And we can play an enormous role for good in protecting nature and the natural world. So how is it relevant to the arts sector? The nature crisis affects us all. We all have a role, but we all equally have a role to play in protecting it. Arts and creativity, many of you would be aware that has obviously communicated on the nature crisis in a really powerful way. And that's particularly true of the visual arts, where there's been some tremendous work done. And many arts organizations have green spaces which can be improved for biodiversity and can draw attention to its significance. And hopefully there's some of you here, and hopefully you might, maybe if you have an opportunity, just post in the chat things that you are doing. I know there's somebody here from the ARC. And for example, that's a very good example of an organization in the middle of the city centre that has a beautiful biodiversity area. I actually saw a small blue butterfly when we were working there not so long ago on their wild sort of balcony area. So it just shows what can be done even with small buildings. Arts organisations can collaborate with other agencies and groups to heighten awareness of the nature crisis, the issues and solutions. And again, that is being done, and we'll have some examples of that. And organisations without green spaces can do a lot, even looking at water and chemicals, because that's one of the big ways we're impacting on the natural world. We don't tend to think about it. We tend to pour things down sinks and flush things down toilets, and not really now think about it. I'm going to stop sharing. And Megan is going to talk a little bit more just globally about how nature is struggling across the world, not just in Ireland, but from an international global perspective.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Katrina. Yeah. So, as Katrina mentioned, we are in trouble, that we have got a nature crisis. We're currently experiencing a global decline in nature and biodiversity as a result of land use change, deforestation, over-exploitation and pollution. So just to kind of give you a bit of a background, the World Wildlife Fund and some other scientific studies in very recent years, probably over the last 5 years or so, have come up with the results that we are currently experiencing Earth's sixth mass extinction, with species disappearing at a rate of 1,000 to 10,000 times higher than the natural background extinction rate. And since 1970, the World Wildlife Fund found that the world has lost approximately 68% of its wildlife populations. So that means that the wildlife populations that have been taking part in this study have decreased in size to roughly 60 to 70%. So that's a huge, huge decrease in just 50 years. So this is a bit of a mouthful. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services estimates that around 1 million animal and plant species are currently threatened with extinction within decades due to human activities. So there's a lot going on out there in terms of the trouble that we're in. And there's a number of different drivers for it. So the greatest nature loss driver at the moment is land use or sea use change. And this means that the management of the land is changing, and that's affecting biodiversity and nature. Conversion of natural forests to agriculture, a really good example is the Amazon. And what's really interesting about the Amazon as a system is that if the forest is degraded, then it affects the rainfall in the area because of that natural cycle that is coming on. And then that means that it can't regenerate itself and the issue compounds itself. Land use change due to agriculture is the greatest driver of nature loss at the moment, but it is forecast to be overtaken by climate change in the very near future. Overexploitation of natural resources. You guys will probably have read about this or understand this already. Overfishing is a massive, massive problem in terms of biodiversity loss. And even since the 90s, the number of fish caught in the wild has quadrupled. So there's major, major pressure on marine ecosystems due to overexploitation. And the same goes for our soils in terms of agriculture and biodiversity. Pollution is another one. The image we popped into the background here is Lough Neagh, which has been in the news quite a lot over the last year or so in terms of the nitrogen pollution that's happening there. Nitrogen pollution is massively damaging the waterways in Ireland and affecting our water quality and by extension, the nature and biodiversity here. Invasive species is another one. Our image that I had popped in here is missing, but it was of rhododendron and wild Neffen. And this is a species that was introduced as an exotic plant for landscaping in the big estate houses in the 1700s and has literally been running rampant across Ireland ever since and is very, very damaging in terms of not allowing natural ecosystems to regenerate because it doesn't belong here. But it is very, very prominent in our landscape. So invasive species is a problem for biodiversity. And then, of course, climate change. The example of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is really like a very impactful one. 50% of the corals have died since the 90s as a result of rise in temperatures because they bleach when the sea changes, when the temperature in the sea changes too much. So climate change, they reckon that has already caused 11 to 16% of biodiversity loss, and this percentage is unfortunately fast increasing. And the situation isn't much better. I know some of those examples were more global, and even here in Ireland, the situation isn't much better. There was a study done for the habitat assessment 4 years ago. This was done by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and they found that 39% of our habitats are in a bad status, and 46% are declining. And this is, now it did say that 52% are stable, but what that means is that they're stable or at an inadequate or bad status. So the tiny little slice of the pie chart there where we're improving is where we want to see across the board. The situation is a little bit better for individual species in terms of some being stable and some improving, and in terms of the status being favorable for roughly 50%, 57% of the species that were surveyed and included in the report and the assessment. But this story is more complicated than that because concentrating on individual species, although it does give you a bit of an indicator, the status of the habitats is actually far more important because that's what actually tells you what's going on in the ecosystem. So back over to Katrina for a sec to talk about Pádraig Fogarty and the work that he's been doing. Oh, Katrina, you're on mute there.
Sorry, just a couple of examples on maybe some of the work that's been done, some of the publications. And this, many of you would probably be familiar with Pádraig Fogarty. I think he's around the same age as me, maybe a little bit younger. So our experiences would be very similar. You know, growing up I was born in 1965, so kind of growing up in the 70s, and that awareness of what was in the natural world at that time and how that has become depleted. And he captures that very aptly with his expression, whittled away. Now, I confess, I haven't read this book because I actually thought it would probably depress me too much. But yeah, it's looking at Ireland's vanishing nature. And then on the next slide, Megan, there was a study that was done, I think, in 2020. So that's kind of looking at fauna and looking at flora, Ireland's changing flora. This was a kind of seminal publication that had taken years to put together, that came out in 2020. And there were three main trends: that Irish native plant species have declined in range and abundance, or both, that native grassland plants are those that have suffered the most, and that in contrast, some of those species that have been introduced into Ireland, and they do say since 1500, so that includes species that we would tend to think of as being our own, like beech and sycamore and so on, species that have become acclimatized to us. But so some of those non-native species are benign, and I know Megan is going to talk about this in more detail, but some of them have become invasive, and they have a really, really negative impact because most of them are not, they don't interact in the way we would like with insects and birds and other species because they too have not evolved together. So that's one of the biggest problems with invasive species. Back to you, Megan.
Thanks, Katrina. So I wanted to chat about baseline syndrome and shifting baseline syndrome to really kind of get a wider sense or an understanding of this concept and this term. So this is a phenomenon that occurs when our perception of the natural environment changes over time due to a lack of historical context. And that's really because we are a short-lived species in the grand scheme of things, compared to the natural environment around us. And essentially what it means is that as generations experience different levels of environmental degradation, we tend to accept the current state of nature as the norm. And this makes it difficult for us to recognize that there's a full extent of damage that's happened over those longer time scales. But I suppose in terms of what that means for the cultural and creative sector, and for those of us working in the arts, I wanted to walk you through a study that was conducted in Disney movies, because I think it kind of explains this quite nicely. So as we all know, Disney movies, if you think about it, they kind of reflect the social representations and meanings of the times in which they were produced. And what this study has meant that I'm going to talk you through now is that the representation of green nature in film mirrors the filmmaker's relationship with nature and their perception of what the public public expectations, what they want, what their audience might like to see. Animated films, obviously, are very responsive to the imagination and intentions of filmmakers. And so they offer this unique opportunity to assess changes over time in individuals' exposure to nature. So this study analysed 60 animated films that were distributed between 1937, which was Snow White, and 2010, which was Tangled, excluding sequels. And it defined 7 categories of settings based on wild and domesticated or cultivated types of nature, further grouped into 4 general categories. So each scene was timed within each category, and a scene was classified as green nature if at least one element of vegetation was present. And the number of animal species included in these settings was counted, excluding the plot relevant characters. And then 3 parameters for each film was commuted: the proportion of film duration showing those natural outdoor living settings, the proportion of scenes showing cultivated natural settings, and the number of animal species in the settings. And the results showed that the proportion of outdoor scenes with green nature decreased significantly over time in these Disney films. And the relative duration of scenes with human-made, cultivated natural settings, such as gardens or agricultural areas and fields, appeared to increase over time. The type of nature represented seemed increasingly domesticated and controlled as the year of production advanced, and these trends actually strengthened when you include Pixar films as well. So the species richness, or the number of animal species drawn in settings, excluding the characters, decreased significantly over time in these Disney films. And there was a positive correlation between animal species richness and the duration of natural settings. So even after controlling for natural settings, species richness negatively correlated with over time. So the implications of this go beyond the films themselves. Like, children's exposure to nature is partly influenced by the movies that they watch, and this diminishing representation of biodiversity in Disney films might contribute to an even greater disconnection from nature for future generations. And this can then pose significant challenges for the implementation of nature and biodiversity measures, as people are just less likely to care for and protect what they feel disconnected from. Natural settings have become less frequent in Disney films over time, but they've also gone a transformation in the way that they've portrayed. The research showed that these settings are increasingly human-controlled and less complex in terms of biodiversity. And this change could reflect the filmmaker's own disconnection from nature and a broader trend in Western societies. So we were thinking, by beginning to understand the kind of intangible impact of that shifting baseline syndrome and the power of our creative industries to kind of emphasize the perceptions of nature in wider society, we could hope to start working towards incorporating more accurate and diverse representations of natural environments in our storytelling. So that was that kind of little case study to kind of just frame that shifting baseline syndrome in a way that is relevant for us. So a little bit, and I suppose in terms of the progress that's happening both internationally and nationally at that kind of framework and policy level. Some of you might have heard about this. In 2022, we had a COP15, a Conference of the Parties for Global Biodiversity. And at that, there was a landmark framework that was signed. And the way that's filtering down is that we're having increasing EU legislation that's coming through and directives, including the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Sustainable finance disclosure regulations are coming, which is going to be really interesting, and reporting standards. And there is now coming forward a task force on nature-related financial disclosures, the Science-Based Target Initiatives, which I'll talk to you about a little bit more in a sec, and an International Sustainability Standards Board, which incorporates nature and biodiversity too. Very recently and quite controversially, that you might have heard about, the Nature Restoration Law was officially adopted just in June there, after a 7th-month delay due to resistance from several EU member states, a lot of protesting. You might have seen some of the farmer protests across Belgium and across the EU. So we've finally gotten to a place, and actually with a lot of lobbying from Ireland too in the EU forum, to put the nature restoration law in place. So this is now setting legally binding targets for restoring at least 20% of the EU's land and sea areas by 2030, and then further goals for 2040 and 2050. And that's indicative as well of shifting baseline syndrome, because 20% of the EU's land is nowhere near enough, but at least it's a starting point, and we're moving in the right direction. So there's some specifics there in terms of different ecosystems, reducing marine noise pollution, which is really important, and restoring peatlands, which are massive, have a massive part to play in both biodiversity regeneration and in mitigating climate change. And what the law has meant is that we have to allocate budgets, develop national restoration plans, and monitor and report on progress. And we're going to look at the application and impact in 2033. So we're hoping to ensure continuous assessment and adaptation. And then nationally, we're seeing some progress and solutions as well. There was a Citizens Assembly on biodiversity loss, and you may have heard quite a lot about this in the media too. It was established in February 2021 with 100 randomly selected members from across the country. The final meeting was in early 2023, and it came out with a really meaty set of recommendations, 159 recommendations across 19 focus areas. And the summary of those, because it would have been too long to go into in today's session, is that the Citizens Assembly called for urgent state action and leadership in this, clear accountability and enforcement, involvement and support for communities and NGOs on the ground, those global and EU commitments, really signing up to those, and then incentives and sustainable practices. And what's happened as a result of that is that we have a new National Biodiversity Action Plan. There's been a huge amount more funding allocated to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So some of the recommendations that are in there have started being acted on. So I'm going to hand back over to Katrina now, one moment, to talk about working with farmers to enhance the natural health of the countryside. So the Farming for Nature initiative, Katrina.
Thanks a million, Megan. So I suppose, for all that we're saying that people aren't aware as much as they might be, or that we're slightly out of touch with nature disappearing, there's obviously a lot of concern about it at the same time. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Some of that is really positive. Many of you may be involved, maybe in initiatives within your organizations, but also locally and where you live. And, farmers often get, I suppose, the brunt of, maybe not exactly the blame, but they're often the focus of some of our anxiety about the damage that's been done to nature. But nature is something that I probably think about almost more than I think about climate change, which is saying a lot. But, if I'm in a bad mood, I'm concerned about nature, I go to this website and I look at some of the stories here, because they're just absolutely transformative. So this was an initiative set up by the wonderful Brendan Dunford, whom some of you may have heard of. He was responsible for the Burren programme, which sadly is no longer, but he's done some fantastic work. And one of the things he did was he set up this Farming for Nature initiative based on the experience that he had of working with farmers in the Burren. And basically what they do is they have a kind of award system every year, and they encourage people to get involved, and they appoint new ambassadors every year. So it started in, I think, about 2019. And I think now there are, I don't know, there must be 100 or more of these farmers. And on this website, you can get stories about the work that they're doing. And I've just picked 3 examples. So really just go and look at these. It would put you in good humor. So Boyd Bryce is an example. He's a farmer up in Donegal doing fantastic work with the great partridge. Bridget O'Connor is an organic hill sheep farmer here in West Kerry, not too far from me. And Bruce Thompson is a dairy farmer, I think, in Offaly, but he's also a Nuffield scholar, and particularly in his area of specialty is the dung beetle. So these people tend to become obsessed with the certain, whatever particular area of nature they're really trying to protect. And because they have such potential to have a big impact, their role is really, really important. So we can certainly give you the link to this as part of the resources, but I would highly recommend that you have a look. And it makes us realize that so many farmers are doing really good work. It's not all negative. And just a few other examples maybe of things that will give us a bit of heart. One was the European Innovation Partnership Programs. There was a whole series of them that ran between up to about 2022, 23. There are more that are happening now, but a huge range of habitats looking at pearl mussels and hen harriers and water systems and so on. So again, some fantastic work being done there. Local authorities are really taking up at least most of them, maybe not all of them, but there's a lot of really good work being done by local authorities, particularly changes in approaches to how you might cut verges and hedges, how weed killer might be used. So for example, Deliri Rathdown has its own biodiversity action plan. Most local authorities have their own biodiversity officer. All of that is really, really promising. If you're looking for a way of sort of identifying the different organizations that maybe have specialties in the area of biodiversity, the environmental pillar is a great resource because it has 32 membership organizations from Birdwatch Ireland, Friends of the Earth, Hedgerows Ireland. So all of those, a lot of them really involving volunteers, doing some really good work. And there are wonderful community groups and initiatives throughout the country. I know even in Kerry, there are probably maybe up to 20 different groups working on promoting biodiversity, saving biodiversity. So that whole approach, I suppose, even to letting grass grow, the no mow may, all of those things are really positive. So what can we do, in the face of that rather dark, this is kind of big picture stuff, reducing food waste and eating a more plant-based diet, but always acknowledging that farmers have a really critical role to play. And most of them, a lot of them are really stepping up the plate to try and do that. Address climate change, because climate change compounds biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss compounds climate change, as Megan was saying with that example of the Amazon. Significantly reduce marine plastic, because any bit of leftover plastic or rubbish that ends up in our landscape inevitably ends up in a water system and ends up going out to sea. And the second big driver then is that whole nitrogen pollution, as we saw with Lough Neagh. But it's a problem with us here in the rest of Ireland, because obviously the EPA just recently came out to say that Irish waters, the water courses, are not improving in the way that they should be. Eradicate invasive species because they have such a dramatic effect on other flora and fauna. Even, again, an example in West Kerry where some of our verges are covered in Montbretia. They smother everything else that grows. Every other plant will eventually be killed off. And unfortunately, Montbretia is of no benefit to any insect or animal species. So it's really not a positive development. Restore natural habitats, particularly water courses, because they affect so many other life forms, particularly that whole insect life, which is quite fragile, and all other animals are dependent on those insects. And reduce or eliminate pesticides and herbicide use. The whole use of herbicide for, spraying outside people's houses and so on is all, we don't really know the full extent of the damage that's doing, but we kind of know it's not good. Now I'm going to hand back to Megan again, and Megan is going to talk to you a little bit about nature. What is nature positive and the impacts that can have for us?
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. Yeah, so in terms of what we can do, both individually and as part of our organizations, if we wanted to take steps towards this, we can become or aim towards becoming a nature positive organization. And the reason I want to chat through this is because the Science Based Targets for Nature have partnered with the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership and have come up with a nice framework for it. So the definition or the terminology nature positive is pretty much trying to reduce and remove those drivers and pressures that are fueling the degradation of nature, which we've chatted about, and working to actively improve the state of nature and ecosystem services. So the idea behind that then would be that the species and ecosystems can start to recover, and there's a new operating model, and this is for all of society and all of economy. Now, there are some lofty goals and aspirations in this, but that's what we need now. But that model being based then on restoration, regeneration, resilience, and circularity. rather than the unlimited extraction, destruction, and pollution that we've seen thus far. So the science-based targets for nature is a nice framework, as I said, and the idea is that it equips companies and organizations with a rigorous and a science-based framework to assess and prioritize impacts on freshwater, on land, on ocean, biodiversity, and climate, and taking on the ground action accordingly through targets, the right actions in the right place and at the right time. And this is across all the value chains. So this is literally beginning with the direct operations on the day-to-day and those different upstream activities from the organization itself. Now, I'm only touching on this just to give you an idea of the work that's out there and the ways that there are to find more kind of frameworks and actual ways of working that can start including the nature and biodiversity piece. And the idea behind it was that there is a lot of climate action that's happening. There's a lot of moves in those directions, and it's to start to facilitate having the conversation around bringing nature into those conversations as well. So if we're starting to put together a climate action plan or a sustainability strategy, that we do the same thing, that we bring in the idea around nature and biodiversity and how that can be part of our plan. So essentially, this is the framework itself. It's adopted from Let's Discuss Nature with Climate from the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. And it's really like a 5-step process, but it's an iterative feedback process. So the idea is to set the scene, have those conversations in the organization, a couple of different ways of getting the team on board, and really doing some research and sector research and starting to understand what the wider regulation and policy is going to mean in this space. There's ways to look at your current position on nature and the ambitions for the future. So this goes hand in hand with climate efforts, assessing the organization's relationship with nature, which is what we've really been starting to kind of talk about in this webinar, and then have a look at those value chain implications. So this is where we start, and we'll go into this when we do the materials and procurement webinar as well, but this is when we start to look at all of the things that we're purchasing and using on a day-to-day and having a little bit of nature awareness in that decision making as well. Then there's really the design phase. So this is the transition plan. So this might be a 3-year sustainability strategy that includes nature and biodiversity actions within it, and what those resources are and what those climate and nature related impacts might be. Then there's looking at the different solutions that can support nature positive transition. So aiming towards being a nature positive organization. What are the commitments that we need? What are the commitments that we can make that are realistic? What are the design and innovations? What are the team excited about? What can we do together? And how can we really start to understand it, report on it, and make it part of what we do, and also working potentially with partners on it. And then all of those fun things like the KPIs, the goals and the targets, getting those in place so that we can expand the knowledge and have a look at the support and continue to work on this, as I said, as an iterative process. So we will be including links to all of these resources for those of you who want to explore it further. But it's nice to know that there is some solid step-by-step processes that are available and that we can take. Closer to home then, there is the Biodiversity Data Centre that Katrina mentioned there. And these guys have got some fantastic resources for Irish organisations and individuals to get on board with emphasising and promoting nature and biodiversity in our own local areas. So it includes biodiversity maps and reports for your local area. I'll talk about that now in a second. There's a space for submitting sightings and records and citizen science surveys. There's templates and biodiversity action plans and frameworks for those that developed by this data centre. There is the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and there's loads of information there on invasive species as well. So essentially, on the Biodiversity Data Centre's website, there is a biodiversity maps portal essentially, and it's a fantastic resource. I would encourage you to go and take a look at it, because what you can actually do with this tool is you can type in where you are. I just popped in the Butler Gallery as an example, because we're doing a piece of work with those guys at the moment. But you can type in where you are in Ireland and it'll bring it up on a map for you. And from that, you can actually run a report on what information the Biodiversity Data Centre actually has for that area. And you can bring it down to a 10-kilometer or a 5-kilometer radius of that area. So as you can see, the Butler Gallery is positioned right there by the river. And from that, you can actually produce reports for what different species are in your area, whether they're threatened, whether they're vulnerable, what list they're on, what kind of status they're in. So that's a really nice piece of freely available resource that's right there on the Biodiversity Data Centre's website. And they also show you the invasive species that are in your area. So if you wanted to start working towards a biodiversity action plan that's really local to the habitats and species that are there, all of that information is actually there to hand so that you could start to focus your efforts on promoting the biodiversity in that area. There's also citizen surveys and monitoring. When you sign up with the Biodiversity Data Centre, if you do start noticing different species in your area, there's ways to go in and get involved in some citizen science through this website. And then there is quite a lot there about invasive species that we've spoken about at the start. Now, I do have a little video to show, which just gives you the opportunity to not listen to me for a few moments. Do let me know if the sound comes through on this for you.
Invasive alien species are animals, plants, or pathogens that would not normally occur in Ireland, but are here because of human activity. When introduced, they thrive to the point of negatively impacting on our wildlife, the services nature provides, our economy, and the way we live. Invasive species have been introduced intentionally for many reasons, but they may then disperse, escape, or be released illegally. They can also arrive here accidentally, as hitchhikers on our vehicles and belongings, or as contaminants on products. There is an increasing trend of introduction of invasive species to Ireland, a trend seen globally, linked to an increase in the movements of people, goods, and an increase in connectivity of trade networks. And the estimated annual cost of invasive species to the economies of Ireland and Northern Ireland is over €261 million. Let's tackle this issue and take measures to prevent their introduction and their spread within Ireland. Help to detect and report them as soon as possible, so a rapid response to contain and remove them can be undertaken. If not, the species may spread and become widely established. The long-term control and management of these species may then be the only remaining option, and that's where it is possible or feasible. We are all part of the solution. Let's prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species by being aware of the biosecurity actions and by reporting sightings. Visit invasives.ie to find out more about invasive species and the role of the National Biodiversity Data Centre. Be sure to check out the What Can I Do section and the Be Petwise, Be Plantwise, and Check Clean Dry biosecurity campaigns.
So yeah, nice little video there from the National Biodiversity Centre and the invasive species.
We're just going to give you some examples, some guidance, resources, and cases. It's really one case study that covers an awful lot. So Megan, I think, mentioned the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and as one part of that, there is a specific plan just for businesses. So your business can help pollinators by becoming a supporter of that. You can sign up, and it's a network of organisations, big and small, who have pledged to take action for pollinators. And it's an entry-level scheme for biodiversity action, which gives you lots of tools. It's aimed at everybody. So even if you feel that you don't have a role to play, that you don't have a green area, give again the example, that wonderful example of the Ark, which, you know, in most circumstances, a building like that wouldn't have those wonderful habitat, but it does. So that guide is fantastic in terms of giving you guidance on how to ensure that any green areas around your building are nature friendly. And remember that any actions you take for pollinators are also actions that will support nature generally. So it's not just for those pollinators. And where there are flowering trees and shrubs, the pollinators will then convert that, when pollinators are present, those flowering trees and shrubs will provide berries in the autumn and winter for birds. and where grass is allowed to grow for nesting bees. That can also create a habitat for other small birds and for hedgehogs and nesting spaces and so on. And, you know, providing shade, avoiding spraying weed killer, longer grass, etc. All of that is a way of supporting nature. And they have a very good resource here, which you can download from the site, car parks for pollinators. So a lot of the organizations that you're in, or even you might be a small organization in a larger building, and there's great potential there. You know, there are green areas outside larger centres which maybe are not being managed properly for pollinators or for wildlife, and you can play a really key role in seeing if you can influence the overall management of that space. And there is an appetite and an enthusiasm for doing this now. 5 or 6 years ago, people might have thought you were a bit crazy, but now I think people are open to doing things differently. So very specifically, I suppose if you have a green space, and I'm using the image here is actually from Shim Sathira, where I worked for many years. So an obvious one is the adopt the no mow May, and that's largely really to leave flowering plants, particularly dandelions, when bees first and other pollinators emerge for the spring. That's one of their first sources of food, as so many of us know now. But you could also maybe leave 1 or 2 areas that you don't cut at all, because obviously when you cut in May, then you've cut the food for those pollinators, and other plants and flowers will flower in their turn. So even to reduce the frequency of mowing is a very important thing. Herbicides, glyphosate, weed killer, whatever you want to call it, is just really a kind of a no-no. And I don't think we fully understand. We're beginning to see the potential impacts that has on humans. And if you think of the size of a human and compare it with the size of a tiny insect and the potential for the poison that's in weed killer to affect insect life, it's massive. So again, you use that All Ireland pollinator plan, and there's a lovely Gardening for Biodiversity booklet that we're going to share with you as well, and that also gives great advice. So, you know, if you're going to set aside an area for nature, make sure that it's visible. You know, put up a sign, because sometimes it can generate negative comment, maybe again a little less so than it once did, because people feel it looks untidy or unkempt. So put up a sign so that people know what's going on. You could look at installing bird, bat or swift boxes where appropriate. These are beautiful boxes that when we were in Sheemseth, that we had these made by a local artist called Nick Taylor. And they were perfectly made. They were artworks in their own right, and they were very carefully placed in such a way that the following spring they were all occupied. They all had their residence. They were all blue tits that took up residence in those bird boxes. So that's another thing that you can do. Finally, maybe looking at conducting a plant audit. And again, that was something we did in the grounds around Sheemseth here. And you'd be amazed about the amount of plants, particularly flora, but also fauna that are available. And to keep a track of that, it also focuses the staff, people you're working with and for. It focuses their mind on what's available in the area that you're in. Yeah, and you know, sometimes this is an area beside Sheemseth, and we were working there, but I do it in my own garden where I mow a path through the long grass. It makes it look more interesting. It's inviting for children. It allows you to walk through that space and maybe admire what's growing in the areas. And again, gives a sense that it's being managed for wildlife rather than just being totally let go. Because some of us might feel that, yeah, we'd like everything to be wild, but obviously not everybody feels like that. So it's trying to, I suppose, build a kind of consensus around that. If you have no green areas adjacent to your building, you could still create a kind of microbiodiversity hotspot. For example, a large planter with perennial pollinator-friendly plants. You know, avoid kind of annual crops, plants that are to be planted every year. You could use herbs, which would nearly always flower and are generally loved by pollinating insects, or even vegetables, in this case, tomatoes in a warm courtyard. And think about installing a water butt so that any water that's needed for that planter is coming from harvested water. And whether you have green space or not, again, you can sign up to that All Ireland pollinator plan and think about hosting events which inform and inspire audiences to care for nature. When the pollinator plan was first launched, I think it was back in 2017, Una Fitzpatrick came to Sheemseth here, and we had an auditorium full of people who were eager to hear what the plan was all about. Then there's, I suppose, you can work with your local authority biodiversity officer to deliver a creative project which addresses biodiversity and biodiversity loss. There's a lot of great collaboration, examples of collaboration. If you think of some of the creative climate action projects where artists and arts organisations and institutions and local authorities can all be working together. You could develop a residency with a nature theme. And this is an example, this image is from where wildflowers grow with Nick, the resident artist down in Theatre Royal. And they've obviously placed a big emphasis on that whole area. And they have they don't have a huge amount of area for biodiversity, but they've set aside an area to the front of their building, which is absolutely beautiful and attracts great attention and really signals their commitment. And again, host non-arts events with experts on nature-based themes, which again is kind of propping up people talking about, people from Sean Renane talking about birds and so on. And you can also support other organisations and agencies in your community, such as Tidy Towns, who now have shifted really towards away from that sort of annuals and weed killer and tidy to that focus on nature and climate change. And all organisations, whether you have a green area or you don't, can raise awareness within the wider staff team, take a field trip to an area where biodiversity can be studied, take part in events during Biodiversity Week, which happens annually in May, and maybe raise awareness on social media, post about, if you're maybe doing something smaller, just mark events like during Biodiversity Week, National Tree Day, World Bee Day, and so on. And then all of us can reduce those impacts that have that are negative in terms of the broader ecosystem. So thinking about how you use chemicals and cleaning materials, because clean water is so critical for insect life and for all life, including ourselves. And maybe looking at outdoor lighting, because excessive outdoor lighting is very bad for insect life and bad for bird life. Can it be reduced, or indeed can it be turned off altogether? All organisations could implement the Think Before You Flush, is a fantastic website, Think Before You Flush, that was set up by Clean Coast, which is part of Antashka, along with Ishka Éireann, and giving some really good advice, but also signage that you can use in your building. So remember, everything, we tend to think of it as kind of a disappearing act, but everything we flush down the toilet and everything we wash down the sink is going into our water systems, and any pollutants in that are eventually going out to sea. So every chemical, even things like air fresheners, cleaning agents, anything used outside your building, drain cleaners, herbicides, pesticides, slug tops, all of that has an impact, a negative impact, unfortunately, on the natural world. So you can download that signage and alert your audiences. And again, many of you may have done this already, just to remind people not to put certain things down toilets or pour certain things down drains. This is a great resource, Gardening for Biodiversity. I know it's specific around gardening, but it's been really taken up by organisations that have green spaces. And it's by Juanita Brown, and was produced by Laois County Council with the assistance of the local authority heritage officer. And we'll give you a link to that later. But again, if you're looking for more tips and advice, that is really useful. And some quick examples maybe of how, from a creative perspective, and there are so many, there's a huge amount of work being done in terms of children and biodiversity and their understanding and awareness of biodiversity. Organisations like Fidget Feet, and so many theatre companies and dance companies doing work with children that focuses their minds on biodiversity and how precious it is. And I've just picked a few examples. These are mostly visual arts examples. Take Me to the River, which was a collaborative piece with Solstice Arts Centre and Canal Research and Design. There was a lot of public engagement in that. It was a piece that the Glucksman did. They had a guided walk of their biodiversity trail as part of an exhibition they had. Groundwork, climate awareness in the UCC art collection. And obviously UCC has done some fantastic work and won a number of awards based on the work they've done to address climate change and biodiversity loss. Quite a number of the creative climate action projects that are ongoing at the moment address the whole area of biodiversity. And I've picked the example of Turn the Tide, led by artists Marie Gordon and Laura McMahon, and that's really focusing on tern conservation work in Kilcool. And Creating Biodiversity is a project in Armore and Galway, working with young adults with special needs to create a kind of visual art exhibition looking at Indigenous species in the area. Just a few do's and don'ts before we come to the example. So yeah, I suppose just remember, we are that big, overwhelming species that is impacting every other species. So everything we do has an impact, and I think we just need to be more mindful of what we're doing. Remember to turn off or down any external lighting as it impacts birds and insects, and just stop generating plastic waste. It's more likely to end up in ditches and rivers or to be incinerated than recycled, and any of those solutions is a negative one. So, for example, 2021, the EPA says roughly 28% of plastic was recycled. The rest of it was either incinerated or ended up in a ditch or somewhere, or ended up in our water courses. In terms of don'ts, just be very mindful. There's a huge enthusiasm for using for wildflower meadows and how to create those. You don't need, you can use them, but you don't need to. There's a seed bed within all soil that will eventually produce over time, will produce flowers. You have to be very careful with wildflower seeds that they don't come from, outside the species, aren't from another country. Obviously, Seed Savers in County Clare do a very good version, but I would really caution against using them at all. And any flowers that come up will probably not come up again the following year because they're not from that area, and they may not be suitable for the insect life and other fauna that are in the area that you're based in. Derek is going to talk about his wonderful honeybees, which is fantastic, but I would say don't feel particularly tempted to install a hive of honeybees. It's just another human preoccupation with using species for our own ends. The honeybee isn't really in danger of extinction. It's all of the other pollinating insects that are in danger, all the other bees that are in danger of extinction. So create habitats that welcome those and focus less on the idea of honeybees. If you have honeybees, that's not a criticism of anybody who has hives and saves the honey and so on. But there are all those other insects that need our support. Just stay away from chemical cleaning products, particularly air fresheners, which are killing us, never mind insects. Don't spray herbicides, weed killer or pesticides, and don't flush or pour toxins or waste into sewers and drain. And I'm going to finish up before we move on to Derek with this image, which is of just to kind of show, we talk a lot about farmers and how farmers use the landscape and the impact they have on it. But this would be a very typical sort of fairly affluent suburb in Dublin. And, there's so little, we've really taken over almost every little bit of wild space where traditionally people would have had front gardens. Now those front gardens, by large, sort of 2 and 3 of them have been turned into places to park cars, and usually 1, 2 and 3 cars. Sometimes they're paved over entirely, sometimes a little bit of tree or a little bit of greenery. So we can't really criticize what farmers do because we have a tendency to do that ourselves. And I do understand people, of course, need to park their cars, and that's very understandable, but we don't seem to have that real facility to kind of do a little bit of both, make space for our car, but also make space for nature. So now we're delighted that Derek Blanche, who has been working in visual for many years and has been leading, along with the rest of the staff team there, and Lucy, leading some fantastic work on biodiversity. We're going to run over a little bit in time, so for which apologies, but it's really fascinating to see what he's done. And he covers a huge breadth of everything that you could possibly imagine that an organization could do to protect and to support biodiversity. Now, he's actually on holidays, so he very kindly recorded this for us before he left. So give me a moment. I have to stop sharing and reshare. So Megan might chat to you while I'm trying to make that all happen.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina, and happy to try and bridge the gap a little bit here. Yeah, I think the driveways is a really good example of exactly everything that we're talking about, because there is that real shifting baseline syndrome that we're talking about, whereby there isn't an awareness that having a little bit of green spaces just anywhere that we can have that massive impact. And it's just something that is where we just think about less and less. So nice little example there.
So hopefully this is going to work for me now.
Hello everyone, my name is Derek Blanche and I work in Visual as the events manager, and I'm also involved in the biodiversity programme. I'd like to thank Katrina for inviting us to speak today about the work that we've done in Visual over the last few years around our bio. Is a theatre and gallery space situated in the heart of Carlow. It opened in 2009. We present a year-round programme of work in our theatre and up to 15 exhibitions per year in our exhibition space. Alongside the work we produce or present, we also curate a learning and engagement programme, which works closely with local schools and within our local communities to provide free and affordable opportunities to access and participate in the arts. As you can see from the photographs, a lot of the new buildings, like a lot of new buildings at the time, there was a lot of emphasis on clean lines and clean spaces, and a lot of the initial planting considerations were based around hardiness and convenience for care. That remained in place till around 2018, when we decided that we want to change how we looked at biodiversity and climate change, and we wanted to set a good example to the wider community also about good practice and relating to biodiversity and recycling. And for ourselves, we really wanted to make a change. So we took out all of the old planting and we got 20 tons of topsoil, pasted in the beds, got a lot of plants in, planted them all. Getting the team involved at this stage was one of the most important aspects of the whole project. It garnered interest among the team and gave the team ownership of the project as well. So we had a lot of help along the way. We planted dozens of trees, lots of flowers, 1,500 bulbs. We allowed the wild spaces to proliferate around visual. And we planted climbers, and we established a minimal cutting ethos where we left wildflower spaces just grow by themselves. In this instance, we took the sod off and we planted seeds from Irish seed savers. But you can, and we've done now with visual, you can leave certain spaces to their own devices. And after about 3 years, they will naturally reseed with wildflowers. And we've done that in visual, and there's been, as good results as with the seeds, if you're patient enough to wait. These were just some of the early photographs that we took from the planting and visual. You can see the daffodils up there making a beautiful display. But this kind of work garnered a lot of interest around the locality and with people coming into visual. And it was very, very positive effect. Around that, then as well, just quickly, we rethought about how we were recycling and our waste management systems. We were using around 9,000 plastic cups for events. We stopped doing that. We were printing 14,000 tickets for events, and we trained the team. We educated the team about good practice. We reallocated spaces for recycling. And we were also doing, at that time, an energy audit with Katrina on the greening venues, which looked at energy usage and recycling, which was very, very positive. Also, as part of this project, we got beehives. The beehives are situated on the grounds of visual in an old orchard that was attached to the seminary in St. Patrick's College. They kindly donated a space for us over there. The bees were naturally tied in with the biodiversity and all of the pollinating plants that we had in place, so we were very eager to put this in. At that time then as well, we started the Bees Needs Project, which was a program of events where the Carlow beekeepers who we had engaged with for the project, they went out to 9 different schools, designing flags and logos and educating the children on biodiversity and bees. And the children came and, they built, bee hotels and insect hotels and just got very engaged. And at the end of the project, they all came into the theatre in visual, around 300 kids, and they presented each other's work to themselves. And it was really, really positive event. There's some of our visual honey. It's in visual shop, so I would recommend anyone to pick up one if you can. It's really, really tasty and really beneficial for you as well. It was great to have a product at the end that just kind of symbolized all of the work that we had been doing. So it was great. As part of that as well, we engaged with local horticulturist Bee Soul. Bee Soul ran a program of videos that went on our website called Plant Banter. And she walked around the roadways and waterways of Carlow, speaking about local, plants and trees, and it just done in a very familiar kind of way, with lots of information that you would never have heard before. And that was on her website, and she would post up videos every week or so. Also at that time we had the project by David Beattie, which was part of the ESB Brighter Futures competition. His project, The Future Light from Distant Stars, won the competition, and so he installed the greenhouse on the grounds of Visual. It's a great talking point for people where we discussed on our school learning program, where we discussed where food comes from, biodiversity, planting and climate change also as well. Part of that, we engaged again with Dee Sewell, and she ran a series of events called Gardening for the Future, where she talked about insects, biodiversity, soil composition, how to compost properly, and they were very well attended. Also, we had the Sustainable Futures project, which was highlighting the climate crisis and encouraging thought on what we could do to make a change. At that time then as well, Deirdre O'Mahony installed her piece at the back of Visual. It was called Sustainment Experiments, and this was exploring alternative crops and alternative planting for agriculture. She got the Lye Society in. You can see the instruments on the left are lies, which was an old technique in the west of Ireland for planting, and each one is as different as each region it comes from, which is very interesting. So we planted potatoes in there originally, which fixed the soil in preparation for the main planting, which was sandfine. And sandfine is a legume. It's a hay, a crop that's used, was used many years ago, but has fallen out of favour now. And it has very long roots. It draws nutrients and nitrates into the soil. It replants over 5 years, and the flower from this plant is also a very good pollinator for the bees. Also, just kind of in connection with that, we had Helena Fitzgerald, who she had an exhibition, and they were asking questions about the climate. What would happen if we did nothing? What would happen if we act? And how do we best plan for the future? And people were able to contribute their thoughts on that in the space. Also, around that time, we did a lot of learning projects. In this one, Claire Breen, it was called Material Matters. She did a dyeing project using natural components, and just showing that you don't have to go with chemicals for that type of thing. As part of that then, part of our whole program, we had Making Noise, which was a part of a program called Our Climate, Our Voice, and it engaged with schools about climate change. We were also part of the URBACT project, which was a European project focusing on urban regeneration. Visual was part of the Carlow delegation, which was very interesting. And the upcycling program with our own Ty McSweeney, he's a technician in the Visual, and we try to encourage artists to use some of the old material that we have, and we also we use anything that's left over. We use them to build tables or to build exhibition spaces, so we're trying to constantly do that. Also the Swarm, which is with Cian Kinsella, which was a performative piece, and that was questioning or allowing children to question about climate change. Coming up, we have Sustainable Futures Summer School, which is a project with Elizabeth Lee and Don Houlihan, and it's about building practices and sustainability, and dyeing and ink making and that kind of thing. And at the moment, we're growing indigo in our greenhouse, which is going to be used for that project. So for this summer, we've changed everything a little bit again. We've done a lot of replanting. So Carlow is taking part in the Entente Foral Europe, which is a competition for towns and villages. And each participating country puts forward a representative town and village, and Carlow is the representative this year. And there's a European judging group that comes, so we've done a lot of new planting around Visual, and that's hopefully will bed in the next few weeks. I know that I'm just on my 10-minute mark, but as the beekeeper in Visual, I just wanted to share one last little interesting thing with you. So, beekeeping is hugely interesting anyway, but one of the very unusual things with beekeeping is the queen. When she arrives from her cell, when she emerges, she will call out to the other queens in the hive. If there are any other queens in the hive, they will respond. They will call back, and they fight. The strongest survives. And if there are any of the queens that are not yet emerged, then she calls to them, and she kills them basically in the cell. It's just not very often heard, and if you listen to the sound, it's being described as quacking or piping, and the queen will emerge into the center of the footage shortly, and you'll hear her. So
apologies, now I cut him off short, but he was thanking us for allowing him to speak. So apologies now that we ran over time a little bit, but Derek is just so amazing, and I take it all back, obviously, when it comes to bees, because he really has a passion for beekeeping. So he's doing it for the right reasons rather than a sort of tokenistic gesture, and all the work that they've done. I suppose what's really striking is that the entire approach is so holistic. Everything that they do, and they're lucky that they had this amazing space all around their building. But, you know, he's really driven so much of that forward, and I just think it's quite extraordinary what they've done in terms of supporting biodiversity. So over to you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. And I would have said the same thing. It's phenomenal the way that it's both practical in terms of using the green space, but also in the programming, and also working the programming into this green space and back again. So it's a very integrated approach. It's
and really engaging with all kinds of people in all kinds of levels, children, schools, local groups, and so on. So it's fantastic.
Right. Thank you for that example. Okay, so folks, we're just about there now, coming to the end of this session. So just to revisit the roadmap and give you a bit of a sense of what's coming up next. So next week, there's going to be a session from 10 to 11 on energy for buildings. That'll be Katrina, that'll be leading that one. And then the week afterwards, on the 16th of July, we're going to get into materials use, materials choices, procurement, and how we can start to make big changes and reduce our impacts through the materials that we use. So that's it from us. Huge thank you all to joining us today.